Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about all of the craziness going on with Oregon State and Washington State. It sounds like the Big 12 might just be an option for them. Obviously, we will learn more over the next couple of days and we'll let you guys know immediately when we do, but definitely something in the air around those two schools. But let's get into the segment 2 here and let's talk about who needs that week 1 win the most. Who is the team that absolutely needs to get a win in week 1 or the entire season could be in a little bit of jeopardy. And I think there's a number of options. Obviously, I want to say this from the jump. Week 1 is not the end all be all by any means. There is a number of things that happen after week 1 that will define the season in a number of ways. So it's not that I'm saying if these teams lose in week 1, you might as well write them off. They're going to be a terrible team this year. It's just to say a week 1 loss could hurt these teams more than it would hurt someone else. So I want to start with Georgia. I do think Georgia needs that week 1 win. I think you look at those games that are coming up at Ole Miss, at Texas, at Bama, and you got to make sure that you're in a position to possibly lose one or two of those games and still be in a position to go to the playoff, to possibly go to the SEC championship. So I think this is a game where you go into a Clemson game, you live in Atlanta, or you're right next to Atlanta, you're going to have the fan base there, you're going to have a lot of things going in your direction. So this is one you got to win. I think you're going to give yourself a little bit of leeway when you win this one, or if you win this one. And if you don't, then you're in a position where you don't necessarily have to run the table, but I don't know if 9-3 gets you in. So that's definitely something that Georgia has to think about, and a huge week 1 matchup against Clemson for them. Penn State is another one that I think needs that week 1 win because you're walking into Morgantown and that is not a layup. Obviously, last year, it was a pretty fun game until the end. Penn State started to pull away, but going to Morgantown is a totally different ball game than playing at home. You were going to fight so many different things at Morgantown that you didn't have to a year ago, and they have to start with a win. If they don't start with a win in this game, then you have Ohio State ahead. You also have to go to LA to play USC. You have to go to Madison to play Wisconsin. There's too many questionable games going forward to think that Penn State's going to make a playoff game if they can't go into Morgantown and get a win. So that's one that definitely has to be a win for Penn State, I think, especially with some of the games coming up on the back end of that schedule. Starting off with a win is just so imperative for that team. USC and LSU, frankly, I want to say both of them need this win so bad because I think both of them need a lot of confidence heading into the season. They have really, really fun offenses, defenses that don't necessarily give you too much by any means, so they're going to need a little confidence heading into the season. I lean a little bit more towards USC, I guess, but it's not like LSU has a ton of layups coming forward and they can just deal with this without any problem. So overall, I think both these teams need this win. I don't know, who needs it more hypothetically, but whoever walks out as a loser is fighting a really tough uphill battle. I can promise you that. And then finally, this one's a week 0 game, but Florida State needs that win against Georgia Tech. This is a team that you're walking in and you should be bigger, stronger in a number of different categories than this Georgia Tech team. And although you're playing in Ireland, there's a ton of different variables that go into that. There are way too many games on this schedule for you to drop this one. There's way too many games like SMU, like Clemson, like Miami, Florida, Notre Dame is on the schedule. There's too many games in the back half of the schedule for them to start off with a loss. This is an attackable Georgia Tech defense. They absolutely should be able to score and be able to score pretty consistently in this game. And if they don't walk out with a win, then Florida State's entire season might go up in flames pretty quickly. But overall, the team that needs it more than anyone is the Florida Gators. I think you look at this team as they head into the season. Billy Napier has about as many questions around him as any head coach in the country. Maybe Sam Pittman has a couple more, but overall, Billy Napier is the story heading into the season for the Gators. There are a number of people who have already said, "Well, he's fired. This season doesn't necessarily matter. He's gone at the end of the year or in the middle of the year, regardless. So doesn't necessarily make a difference." I don't necessarily subscribe to that quite as much. I do think this is a good Florida team, but when you look at that first week game against Miami, you're going to have a huge one that you're going to, frankly, have to win. And let's start with the obvious here. The schedule is a nightmare. You look at all of the different things they're going to have to face this upcoming year. 2 weeks after this game, they have A&M coming to town. Then they go to Starkville. Then they have UCF at home. They have Tennessee, Kentucky, and then they have the nightmare 5-week schedule at the very end where it's Georgia, at Texas, LSU, Ole Miss, at Florida State. That's mean. I have said this a number of times. That is just outright abusive to Florida in the last 5 weeks of the season. So, point being, you have to find at least 5 wins before you get to that game. You have to make sure you're in a position to, maybe you can steal one of those back 5 games and make it to a bowl game, but you need to be in a position where you don't have to pick up 2 of those wins. You don't need to pick up 3 of those wins. Maybe you need to get 1 at some point throughout that 5 game stretch to make a bowl game. So that's the position that they're in. That's just the reality of this situation. So they need to find a way to get those big time wins, and they will not be favored in that A&M game if I had to imagine, especially if they beat Notre Dame. But if they fall to Notre Dame by 14 points, maybe that one's a little bit more even. They will be underdogs against Tennessee, and then UCF and Kentucky are not layups. So it's not like they're going into the first half of their schedule saying, that's a definite win, that's a definite win. I think Samford is the only one that's a definite win on the schedule, and that is not going to be enough for Florida by any means. So I think the biggest thing here, though, more than, the schedule and more than having to make a bowl game, is just the perception around that guy. We talk about Billy Napier so much throughout this offseason, and he's someone that has a ton of attention on him going into this season, but there's a reality here where they lose in week 1 and all of the talk immediately changes from maybe there's something here to they're dead. This entire team has nothing to play for anymore. Billy Napier is not the head coach. He's going to be fired at some point this year. And would it be fair? Probably not, because it's a week 1 game, as we talked about, and not anything is really fully decided in week 1. But that's the reality of this situation. When you play an in-state rival like Miami, when you have so many questions heading into the year around your head coach, there's going to be people saying stuff at the end of that game, one way or the other. If Florida comes out on top, there will be people saying maybe Florida has something going down there with Billy Napier and we just need to give him some more time. If they lose that game, I can promise you there will be people in Florida garb calling for his job the next day. That's just the reality of this sport, and it's one where you look at Billy Napier this year, everything is perception for him. Perception is reality in a lot of different ways in the coaching world, and I think when you look at Billy Napier, the perception is not great right about now. If you look at the common college football fan, they don't necessarily love what this guy's doing at Florida. They don't necessarily think it's going to be a super successful model, and there's a lot of things going against him. I've talked about this before on here. That has not infiltrated the locker room yet, which is a huge, huge thing. There's so many players talking about how incredible this has been for them and how great of an environment it's been in that building. That really matters. And frankly, it can go away in an afternoon. That's the reality of the sport, where you have so many guys to take care of. You have so many guys to worry about that if you lose a game to a team like Miami and the next morning they wake up and scroll Twitter and see all of these different comments about how their team is worthless and that this season is pointless and Billy Napier is going to get fired, you would lose those kids pretty quickly. And it's a terrible thing, obviously. It's the reality of the sport now with social media and with all of the different things that come into play. But he's done a really, really, really good job of keeping everyone engaged, of having everyone walk into the season with as much confidence as possible. That can go away in week 1. And if that does happen, then you're in a really, really tough spot going forward. And you're probably in a position where Billy Napier is gone before the end of the year. And that's the thing that really should worry this entire program, because the reality is anytime you go through a coaching hire or firing and hire, then you're going to have issues. You're going to have things to get over. And while I do think there's a lot of good things down at Florida, there's still some things to rebuild. There's no two ways about that. And I think there's a number of guys on this roster that if Billy Napier wasn't there, they wouldn't be there. And I think the number one guy, that is Billy Napier. The number one guy is DJ Lagway. I think you look at this quarterback, he is the most important guy on that roster right now. And I know he's not playing this year, which makes it sound a little bit crazy, but this is the guy that came in and they said, this is a program changer. This is a guy that can walk in, be your starter, lead you back to where Florida should be, and then walk off into the sunset, leaving the program much better than the way he found it. He is someone you need in that program. I tend to believe if Napier is fired and he walks out the door, DJ Lagway is not too far behind him, and he has a ton of calls coming in on that evening when Billy Napier is fired, whether it's allowed or not. I can promise you that. So he's one of those really, really talented guys, and along with him, you have LJ McCray, you have Eugene Wilson, you have a number of really talented guys on this roster that frankly would probably find somewhere else to play if Billy Napier was not on that staff, because as a lot of us know at this point, a lot of kids commit to a coach, they don't commit to a program. Whether I like that or not is totally up in the air. I don't necessarily love it, but that's the reality that we play in. So someone like DJ Lagway walking out of the program would put you back a number of years, because those guys don't just grow on trees. We know how important the quarterback position is from a recruiting perspective, and hitting it out of the park with a guy like this is not something that's going to happen every cycle, especially with a first-time head coach in a program that just fired a head coach in the middle of the season. So you're adding a ton of variables into a situation that is already very crazy and very variable in and of itself. So I do think this is a program that has a lot of good things. I think you look at the interior of this program and you would think that it would be, chaos with all of the questions around Billy Napier and all of the different things going into this year that could go sideways. You would think the behind the scenes would be a little bit sideways as well. It doesn't feel like it is. It feels like everyone is pulling in the same direction. Everyone understands that this is going to be a tough season, but we are good enough to pull this thing off. Billy Napier has all of the confidence in the world in his team, but when you look at that week 1 game, all of that could change in an afternoon. You're not playing, USF. You're not playing FAU. You're playing Miami. You're playing a team that a lot of your fan base hates, to their core they hate, and that really does matter when you walk into a season where you're trying to prove everyone wrong, where you're trying to do what everyone is saying you can't do. If you lose that game, you're proving everyone right in an afternoon. And frankly, you could prove them wrong throughout the rest of the season, but the chips will be stacked against you throughout the rest of the season, because maybe you lose a couple of the players, at least in terms of being mentally all the way there. Maybe you lose some of the boosters that you absolutely need. And overall, you're going to lose a lot of the recruiting power that you had, and that is what kills a coach. So overall, I think when you look at those week 1 games, there are a number of ones that need to be wins for that particular team. I think Georgia absolutely needs a win against Clemson. I think Notre Dame likely needs a win against A&M. I think a number of different games to unpack there, but overall, I don't know if anyone touches what Florida needs in week 1. And frankly, they're not favored in that game, so it's not necessarily looking great for them to win that game, but Billy Napier might just need it, or his fate might just be sealed in that week 1 game, which would be a little bit ridiculous, but is the reality of the sport right now. So definitely will be a really interesting thing to watch, but when it comes to week 1 games, none is more important than that Florida-Miami game for Billy Napier. But let's take our second break here, and when we come back, we're going to talk about the coaches poll. It came out a couple of days ago. Want to break that down, give you guys an idea of who I think is a little too high, who I think is a little too low, and we'll break down a couple of different outcomes of this. So we'll break that down right after this, so stick with us.